Hi, we're gonna open up part 3 now of lecture 12. Right, we talked about how stereotypes are part of the deal in keeping people out of the jury. Now we've invoked a stereotype in the one verdict theory of bringing one person into the jury who will kind of like control the process, and that is epitomized in the movie 12 Angry Men. Great movie. Remember, there's 2 versions, the original version, black and white, and then the movie was so popular with actors that actors demanded that someone make to do the movie over again, right? To make it, and that version is in color. And bonus question, who's an actor who appeared on the jury in 12 Angry Men in the original black and white version as a young man, and then appeared in the remake as an elderly man? One actor was in both. Anyone know who that was? I'll leave it to you to figure that out. Anyway, let's talk about the similarity leniency hypothesis. And I'll also share kind of a silly thing I did on my way to graduate school. On the way to my graduate school one day, when I first got to Ohio State in the social psych department, going into graduate school, I remember meeting with Phil Tetlock, and Dr. Tetlock, asked me, so Mark, if you could research anything right now, this coming quarter, this coming year, you have to do a first-year project. What would you like to research? And I said to Phil, I said, well, I'd like to study how similarity affects jury decision-making. That is, are people going to be more lenient or more punitive to those who are similar to them or dissimilar in a legal decision-making context? And Phil, very thoughtful guy, kind of sat back in his big leather chair, pushed it back a little bit, and then he looked at me and he said, okay, similar how? And at that point I reflected and realized how kind of stupid I was. Because, and then he says, similarity can be across many different dimensions. And it was like, oh, geez. And I'm like, yeah, that's not too good. And I said, I guess I got no ideas right now what I want to do. And he said, no sweat, I got a project for you. And he gave me a project for my fair share project to do some research for him. So it all worked out. And it was, but it was kind of just immature thinking on my part. And that's part of graduate school, as you come in with a kind of a lot of immature perspectives, and you get your feet put to the fire, and you start thinking maybe a little more strenuously, a little more critically, right? So, but let's leave the let's not take the similarity away, because some people ascribe to this idea. That similarity leniency hypothesis, that is, jurors who are demographically, socially similar to the litigant will favor him or her. So to the extent that the jurors are similar to the defendant, then we expect the similar jurors to side with the defendant that they perceive to be similar and are more lenient towards that person. And there's some evidence that this is true, that it does work in some cases, but the problem is that it may also backfire, right? That is, sometimes similarity drives just the opposite reaction, not to be more lenient, but to actually be more punitive, to be more punishing, right? And this is what research has demonstrated as the black sheep effect. And that is, group members who in some circumstances may be harder on members of their own group as the black sheep of the group because they don't fit in. And this is especially prevalent when the behavior has consequences for the group or reflects poorly on the group. So if it's going to enhance the nature of a negative group stereotype, then often group members will be more punishing towards that person. This isn't like us, this is an outlier, this is a black sheep. We're going to show you how much it's not like us by coming down on them even harder. So again, circumstances dictate what we're going to see, and circumstances differ drastically. Bottom line, perceptions of similarity can occur across almost unlimited dimensions, and that's what Phil was explaining to me. I will say, an aside though, I did have in the class 4520, back in the days when it was quarter system and it was 520, I used to run the class often with a theme of jury decision making. Most students found it interesting, and I had one team who really wanted to do the similarity thing. And I said, you know, I explained, I told them the story, right? I bored them with that story, and I said, yeah, but here's the problem with similarity. And they said, they came back in the next class session, they said, I think we found a workaround. And I said, what do you got? And they said, well, rather than tell the students, the participants, how this person is similar, we would like to just tell them as they're reading the crime story, and this was their manipulation, one of their independent variables. They said, we're going to tell half the people to pretend that the defendant is similar to them, and we're going to tell the other half the participants nothing. Right? So that would be the control group. And it was a brilliant idea, and it actually worked. So they effectively manipulated a perception of similarity by not worrying about directing them to a certain domain of similarity, just the general idea of similarity versus non-similarity. Brilliant idea, I thought. They were really clever in that. Teaching that class is a lot of work, but I do miss the creativity that students demonstrate in solving some of those really difficult issues. That being said, it's a class that's best taught by graduate students, I think, rather than old people like me. So, of all those that I've talked about, what is the common thread, right? What do all those methods have in common? And it's some form of stereotyping, right? So it's the reliance on some average type and our beliefs, our experience about people of that type. So core to most of these selection processes then is some element of stereotyping. Now let's ditch that. Let's move on to a completely different approach, and this is a presentation type approach, right? And it's for good actors, and if you can sell this shit, maybe it'll work, maybe it won't. The first 12 called. So in this case, we don't challenge anyone. And what we say here, then imagine I just come in as the attorney, there's my defendant, and my defendant might not like this, but I'm going to take kind of a risk, at least I believe it's a risk. I'm going to walk in and say, ladies and gentlemen of the court, the Honored District Attorney, Your Honor, sitting on the bench, all you potential jury members, here's the deal. I am so convinced that of the obviousness of my client's innocence that any 12 people anywhere on the planet can sit on this jury, and I have absolute confidence that they will in fact find the defendant not guilty. So we have nothing further to say, Your Honor. Anyone that the prosecution selects is okay with us. And you know, it's like if I'm in the defendant's chair, I'm going like, is this really a good idea or not? You know, but so. And this could be based on past negative experiences with more conventional techniques. Maybe the attorneys hired consultants, they've talked to people, they've tried to play the game, they've been disappointed often enough that they're just like, hey, give us anyone, and my job is to do my job, and I will do it well, and everyone will be okay. So we call it the first 12 called approach. And if you can put on a big show, if you can really bring out your acting chops and get it done, right, maybe it'll work. All right, let's shift gears a little bit, and I want to talk about then some personality components that might predict jury behavior, jury decision making. And notice that you can't give potential jurors personality questionnaires. This is not something that's done, nor should it probably be done. But in the laboratory, we have the ability to give participants personality questionnaires, give them mock court cases to process and see if there's any correlation between their sentencing choices and a personality construct. So the construct that's most often used in this is authoritarianism, and this was developed by Adorno back in the day. It was called authoritarianism. It was measured on the F scale. What does it do? Well, authoritarians tend to need less evidence to prosecute someone, and they tend to favor harsher punishments. So probably don't want a bunch of authoritarians on your jury because they're going to hold your feet to the fire to a greater extent. That's the belief. Authoritarianism measures people who rigidly adhere to traditional values, identify with and submit to authority, and behave punitively towards norm violators. Now, authoritarian may boomerang if someone who's in a position of authority makes a violation heinous enough. Authoritarians might come down on them even harder, kind of like the black sheep effect, as we discussed. Now, a more modern version of this measure from Adorno was developed by Altmaier, and it's called right-wing authoritarianism. And many of us argued, well, is there such a thing as left-wing authoritarianism? And lo and behold, measures have been developed for that as well, but not useful in the context of our jury decision making. So, how might right-wing authoritarianism interact with information? And what we did then is, in part of our research, is we measured participants' right-wing authoritarianism, and it's a long scale. If I remember correctly, it's about a 34-item scale, and we had the opportunity to give this scale to about 700-800 participants in an earlier study. From that, we did factor analysis to see if we could extract a factor for from those 34 questions, see if a subset of questions loaded on increased punitiveness. And we were able to extract this, and the benefit in so doing was in our future research, then we could use about 7 or 8 of the right-wing authoritarianism questions that directly spoke to predicting a person's increased punitiveness. It shortens the experimental period. I mean, it really is kind of a logistical thing, right? And that's why we did it. So participants were randomly assigned to one of 3 word puzzle conditions prior to the actual experiment, and that's a lie because the word puzzles, this is all part of one big experiment, but it was presented as multiple small experiments. What we wanted to do was prime people to either become more punitive or more lenient, and then of course we had a control condition in the middle. So we would expose people to the priming manipulation, and then after that people were then given an unassociated, not associated to the first measure, right, which is a lie. Then we would give them court cases to read, and then we would assess the punishment that they wanted to give to the perpetrator in the crime. So participants were given a priming manipulation. In this case, a word puzzle is one way we did it, right? And then they read a case about a criminal and were asked to assess the level of guilt. How guilty is this person? How guilty do you believe them to be? And how much punishment do you want to give them? So let's look at these priming manipulations, and you might have been exposed to some of these. The idea is to put a notion in someone's non-conscious mind that affects their subsequent interpretation of the court case they're going to read. So when we're priming, and this is going to look ridiculously silly to you, but the strange thing is it works, right? And often use scrambled sentence tasks. That is, you scramble the words in a sentence and have people unscramble them. Or you can use scrambled word tasks and people unscramble the words. What we found is often people couldn't, not often, but sometimes when people can't unscramble the sentence successfully or can't unscramble the word, then we have to eliminate them as participants. So we went to an easier version of this, stupidly easy, but everyone could get it right, so we didn't have to omit data points. So they were asked simply in this case, hey, here's a list of words. Remove the X's as quickly as you can, and then write the word that's revealed over to the right-hand side of the paper. So you can imagine they have 15 words. About 8 of those words are neutral, and about 7 of the words are target words in one condition to prime punitiveness, and a different condition to prime leniency, and then in the middle condition they have 15 neutral words. So you can just watch people do this. They scratch out the X's, scratch, 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 and then they write the word over there, and they move on, and we told them it was a time task, so we want them to hurry to see how quickly people can process information, whatever bullshit story we gave them. So, what word do we have here? Scratch out the X's, it reveals punish. Scratch out the X's, it reveals control. A couple more words like this primes people to become more punitive. Now, on the leniency side, because we want to see if it's, we can operate this in both directions, let's try this one. So we scratch out the letters and we reveal the word mercy, and in this case then we reveal the word forgive. The whole idea was that there's only 7 of these words and then 8 neutral words, so people don't understand what we're doing. Because as soon as people understand what you're trying to do, right, then it's not going to work. So what do we see? Well, this is the likelihood of guilt, and the scale's less likely to more likely, right? And you can see then the lenient condition, right, was overall less likely, and we see the harsh condition, right, is this line, which was overall more persuaded that the defendant was guilty, with the control condition laying somewhere in between, and that's what we kind of expected to find, right? Not the most powerful effect in the world. Well, we use other priming techniques as well. So this is hit or miss. This was virgin ground. But I think what was fascinating about this, because remember, we had the authoritarian control 7 questions that we're able to give people as well. So we can correlate performance and we can look at right-wing authoritarians and how they are affected. And this was unanticipated, so we didn't hypothesize this. Obviously, then at that point you have to replicate to make it good. You have to turn it into a hypothesis and replicate it. Time didn't allow, because we're always moving on. But we saw then the interaction between punitive prime and participant right-wing authoritarianism significantly predicted increased punitiveness over the control condition. What does this mean? Well, as a person's right-wing authoritarian increases, they were more likely to endorse the severe punishment for the target in the priming condition that primed severity of punishment, right? So, 2 things to be taken. Yes, authoritarians will punish more, and they will be more sensitive to environmental circumstance, be it priming or information. They will be more sensitive to that and use it to justify increasing their punishment to a greater extent. So we thought that was pretty cool, and we know this kind of from our own life experience, that harsh people are more likely to interpret circumstances as justified in creating harsh response. So people are primed, and we use that term, either scientifically or they're primed to see the worst in others, right, as authoritarians. A couple other personality constructs that are interesting in this regard. Julian Rotter's locus of control. Do you believe that life's outcomes are under your control, or do you believe that life's outcomes are basically due to chance? And notice this is a continuum, so we vary. Some have very internal locus of control, that is, they believe they're the masters of the universe. Other people have very low locus of control, externalized, and they believe that shit happens, if you will. The internal believe that controls what happens, the externals believe that other events, luck, etc. And it seems to externalize to others, so internal view defendants as more responsible and punish more severely. So I have a high internal locus of control, I'm probably likely to be more punitive as predicted by that personality measure. Civil trials, it's especially important, they're very sensitive to any role the plaintiff played in their own damages, right? So, like suing McDonald's for burning you with coffee, well, you put it between your legs, you have some culpability in and of yourself, so internals would take that as a more potent factor. Ultimately, can lawyers pick juries? Well, they're very confident in their abilities, which makes sense because this is what they do for a living. But what we see is juror selection strategies weren't different from or better than those used by students in research. So again, it's kind of like lie detection. People think they can do it, but when we put them in the lab, we find out, no, they operate basically at the level of chance. Kerr et al. Did no better at chance than guessing which jurors were likely to be biased against them. So again, the empirical support says we may want to believe that we can do this, but when it comes right down to it, can demonstrate not so much. Okay. Summing up jury selection then, many of the techniques we've discussed rely on stereotyping. Individual personality characteristics can be difficult to assess, especially from appearance, right? Personality characteristics may interact with situational variables in very complex ways, as evidenced by our priming studies, and I think there's a lot more that is being done in that regard. Now, here's one of the issues, though. If you try to present this information to lawyers, right, they're going to largely reject laboratory empirically based evidence. And part of this is that this ability to pick jurors is often tied very significantly to an attorney's self-esteem. So to admit that they can't do it is to admit, right, what they might consider personal failing. And so self-esteem might not allow them to do that, right? And finally, if we go all the way back to the beginning of this, we're all about trying to select a fair and representative jury. But what does that necessarily mean? What constitutes a fair and representative jury? How would we measure that? How would we know if we're succeeding in doing that or we're falling short of that goal? And think about how difficult that might be to operationalize. So this is about jury selection. Now we're going to come back for lecture 13, and we're going to talk about what happens in the jury box, what's happening in the juror's mind, and the ideas of processing information within a juror's context. So thanks for this one, and we'll see you in the next one. Stay well, stay healthy, and take care. Bye.